The gallery stretched in shadow and memory, its walls lined with portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow anyone who dared intrude upon their silent vigil. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light that pierced through the heavy velvet drapes, illuminating the polished wood floor in a golden stripe that cut the room in half. The air smelled of beeswax and old leather, of secrets kept and stories untold. It was a room that demanded reverence, a space where the past pressed close against the present, where every breath felt like an intrusion upon something sacred. Marianne stood before the portrait, her travelling cloak still fastened at her throat, though she had arrived at Ashford Manor nearly an hour ago. The household staff had been kind but distant, their eyes lowering respectfully as they took her bags and assured her that His Grace would be informed of her arrival. She had not asked for him. She had come for other reasons entirely, reasons that had seemed clear and necessary when she left London 3 days prior. But now, standing in this gallery where memories lived in oil and canvas, she felt the weight of her decisions settling over her shoulders like a physical thing. The man in the portrait stared back at her with eyes that held both kindness and an unfathomable sadness. His jaw was strong, his bearing aristocratic, but there was something in the set of his mouth that spoke of disappointment, of dreams deferred or destroyed. She had seen that expression before, though never in life, only in the careful brushstrokes that transformed pigment into personality. The plaque beneath the gilded frame read simply, Lord Edmund Ashford, 1788-1819. She reached out without thinking, her gloved fingers tracing the edge of the frame as though she could somehow touch the man himself, as though she could reach across the years and offer comfort to someone who had long since passed beyond all earthly consolation. The wood was smooth and cool beneath her touch, solid and real in a way that made her feel unmoored, as if she were the ghost haunting this room rather than the painted figures on the walls. He was my brother. The voice came from behind her, low and rich, carrying undertones that sent a shock of recognition through her entire body. She had not heard that voice in more than a decade, not since the summer before her marriage, but she would have known it anywhere. It had haunted her dreams, whispered to her in moments of weakness, reminded her of all the choices she had made and all the paths she had not taken. Marianne turned slowly, her hand falling away from the portrait, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes found him in the doorway. Dorian Ashford stood backlit by the corridor's brighter illumination, his silhouette broad and commanding, in a way that made the doorway seem too small to contain him. He had changed in the years since she had last seen him, changed in ways both subtle and profound. The boy she remembered had carried himself with a kind of restless energy, always moving, always searching. The man before her now possessed a stillness that spoke of hard-won control, of desires mastered and passions locked away. He stepped forward into the gallery, and the light caught his features fully. Her heart stuttered. Time had been kind to him, refining rather than diminishing, adding character to what had already been a face of striking appeal. His dark hair was longer than fashion strictly dictated, touching his collar in a way that suggested he cared little for London's current standards. His eyes, that particular shade of grey that could appear silver in certain lights, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away, even as it pinned her in place. "Your Grace," she managed, the formal address feeling strange on her tongue, wrong somehow, as if she were speaking to a stranger rather than the man who had once known her better than anyone. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Marianne. Just her name, nothing more, but the way he said it carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. It held accusation and longing, anger and tenderness, all wound so tightly together that she could not separate one emotion from another. She realized with a start that she was trembling. "I did not mean to intrude," she said, hearing the formality in her own voice, hating it. "I asked the housekeeper if I might wait here. The servant said you were out riding." "You are not intruding." He moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate, each one carefully placed as though he were navigating treacherous ground. "Ashford Manor is open to you, as it has always been, as it should have been." The last words carried an edge she could not quite interpret. She turned back to the portrait, needing to look at something other than his face, needing a moment to gather herself before she spoke again. "I did not know you had lost a brother," she said quietly. "I am sorry. He must have been very young when he passed. He was. Dorian came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of horse and leather, and something indefinably him. 31. I was 19. Edmund was everything our father wanted in an heir. Everything I was not. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of resigned acceptance that somehow hurt more than anger would have. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, saw the way he looked at the portrait with a mixture of grief and something else, something that might have been guilt. "What happened?" she asked, though she was not certain she had the right to such questions anymore, not after so many years of silence between them. "An accident on the hunting field." His voice was flat now, carefully neutral. His horse took offense badly. Edmund was thrown. He struck his head on a stone and never woke. He paused, his jaw working. "It was very quick, they told me. He did not suffer. And you became the heir." "And I became the heir," he agreed. "A role I never wanted, a title I never sought. But that is the way of such things, is it not? We do not always get to choose our fates." The words hung between them, heavy with implications she was not ready to examine. She turned away from the portrait, meaning to put distance between them, to find some neutral ground where they could speak without this terrible weight pressing down on every word. But he reached out as she moved, his hand catching her arm gently, not restraining but requesting. "Why are you here, Marianne?" She stopped, looking down at his hand on her arm, at the way his fingers curved against the dark fabric of her sleeve. Even through the layers of cloth she could feel the warmth of his touch, the strength barely leashed. It would be so easy to lean into that touch, to let herself be drawn back into the orbit of this man who had once meant everything to her. But she had not come here for that. She had not come here for him. "I need your help," she said quietly, meeting his eyes at last, seeing the flash of surprise there before he schooled his features back to careful neutrality. "I have nowhere else to turn." He released her arm, but he did not step back. "What has happened? Where to begin? How to explain the tangle of obligation and duty, of promises made and debts owed, that had driven her from London to this place, to this man she had sworn she would never see again?" She took a breath, steadying herself. "Alistair left debts," she said, "substantial debts, and creditors who are not inclined to be patient with a widow who has nothing to offer them but excuses and empty promises." His expression darkened. "Your husband was a wealthy man." "The Winthorne estate is entailed," she interrupted. "Every acre, every stone, every piece of silver. It all went to Alistair's cousin upon his death. I was provided for in the marriage settlement, of course. A jointure, a house in Bath, an annual income that would have been sufficient if—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "But Alistair's personal debts were not part of the estate. Those fell to me as his widow, and they are considerable." "How considerable?" She named the sum, saw his eyes widen fractionally before he controlled his reaction. It was a staggering amount, the kind of debt that could destroy a family, that could see a woman cast into debtor's prison or worse. "Good God," he said softly. What was he thinking? "He was not," she said simply. "Thinking, I mean. Alistair loved me in his way, I believe that. But he also loved cards, horses, investments that promised quick returns. He always believed the next wager would be the one that turned everything around. And when it was not—" She made a helpless gesture. "He borrowed against my jointure. He took loans using my name. When he died, the creditors came to me, and I discovered that the comfortable life I thought we had was built on sand." Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the portrait of his brother and back again. She could see him thinking, weighing options, calculating in that way he had always done when faced with a problem that required both logic and strategy. "You want me to pay his debts," he said finally. Not a question. "I want you to loan me the money," she corrected, lifting her chin. "I will repay you every penny. I have the house in Bath. I can sell it, sell everything if necessary. But the creditors want their money now, and I cannot—" Her voice broke despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I cannot go to prison, Dorian. I cannot." He moved then, closing the distance between them in 2 swift steps, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. The touch was firm, grounding, almost painfully real after so many years of absence. "You will not go to prison," he said fiercely. "I will not allow it. Do you understand me? I will pay every debt, satisfy every creditor, and you will not speak of repayment or selling houses or anything of the kind. I cannot accept charity. It is not charity." His hands tightened fractionally on her shoulders, and she saw something flash in his eyes, something that looked like anger but felt like pain. "You should never have had to come here. You should never have been placed in this position. If I had known, if I had any idea that Winthorne was the kind of man who would—" He stopped himself, his jaw clenching. "But I did not know. I made it my business not to know anything about your life after you married. It was easier that way. Or so I told myself." She stared up at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must surely hear it. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his pupils dilated as he looked at her. He was still beautiful, still devastating in the way that had always undone her, and the way he was looking at her now with that mixture of concern and something deeper, something hungrier, made her breath come short. "Dorian," she whispered, though she did not know what she meant to say, what plea or protest she intended to voice. He released her abruptly, stepping back, putting proper distance between them once more. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, the momentary lapse back into formality that felt like a shield raised between them. "You will stay here," he said, "at Ashford Manor. I will write to my solicitors in London tonight, instruct them to settle your affairs. It may take some time to locate all the creditors and satisfy their claims, but I promise you it will be done. And in the meantime, you are under my protection. No one will touch you here. I cannot impose on your hospitality for weeks. You can and you will." His tone left no room for argument. "Besides, you will hardly be imposing. The house is enormous and half empty. I rattle around in it like a dried pea in a pod. Your presence will be—" He paused, and something shifted in his expression, became softer, more vulnerable. "Welcome. Your presence will be welcome." She should refuse. She knew that. Staying here in his house under his roof was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with creditors or debts or social propriety. Staying here meant being close to him, seeing him daily, remembering all the reasons why she had once loved him with a desperation that had terrified her. But what choice did she have? She had already swallowed her pride enough to come here and beg for his help. Refusing his hospitality now would be both foolish and insulting. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You are very kind." "Kind," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That is not a word anyone has ever applied to me before. Capable, perhaps, efficient, certainly, but kind." He shook his head. "Do not mistake necessity for kindness, Marianne. I am doing this because I must, because the alternative is unthinkable, not because I am a good man." Before she could respond to that cryptic statement, he had turned and was walking toward the door, his stride long and purposeful. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "Mrs. Holloway will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 8. I trust you will join me." It was not a question, and she found herself nodding even as he disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving her alone once more with the painted eyes of his dead brother, and the ghost of a conversation that had revealed far more than either of them had intended. She turned back to the portrait, studying Edmund's face with new understanding. This was the brother Dorian had lost, the heir who had died and made Dorian a duke. This was the wound that had never healed, the grief that still shadowed his eyes even after all these years. And she, in her desperation, had come here and forced him to relive it all by standing in this gallery, touching this frame, asking questions she had no right to ask. "I am sorry," she whispered to the painted figure, though she could not have said exactly what she was apologizing for intruding on private grief, perhaps, or for the way she had once broken Dorian's heart by choosing another man, or simply for being here at all when her presence clearly caused him pain. The portrait stared back, offering no absolution, no comfort, only that same sad knowing look that suggested Edmund Ashford had understood something about suffering that his younger brother was only now beginning to learn. Mrs. Holloway proved to be a woman of middle years with kind eyes and an efficient manner that suggested she had been managing Ashford Manor for long enough to know all its secrets. She led Marianne through corridors lined with more portraits, past rooms whose doors stood open, to reveal furniture shrouded in Holland covers, up a grand staircase whose banister gleamed with fresh polish despite the general air of neglect that hung over the house. "His Grace does not entertain often," Mrs. Holloway explained as they climbed. "Most of the family apartments are kept closed, but your rooms have been aired and prepared. I hope you will find them comfortable." The rooms in question proved to be a suite overlooking the south lawn, with tall windows that let in floods of afternoon light and a view that stretched across manicured gardens to the parkland beyond. The furnishings were elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of understated luxury that spoke of old money and older taste. A fire had been lit in the grate, and her bags had already been unpacked, her clothes hanging in the wardrobe as though she had always belonged here. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" Mrs. Holloway asked from the doorway. Marianne shook her head. "No, thank you, this is perfect." "Dinner at 8, then. I will send a maid to help you dress." When the housekeeper had gone, Marianne moved to the window, looking out over the gardens to the rolling hills beyond. It was beautiful country, peaceful in a way that London never was, that Bath had never been. She could understand why Dorian had retreated here after inheriting, why he had turned his back on society and made this isolated estate his refuge. But it was also lonely. Even from here, she could sense it, the emptiness that pervaded the house despite its grandeur. This was not a home where laughter echoed in the halls or children played in the nursery. This was a mausoleum, a monument to loss and duty and all the things Dorian had never wanted but had been forced to accept. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, remembering the way he had looked at her in the gallery, the way his hands had felt on her shoulders. He had said her presence was welcome, but she wondered if that was true or merely politeness. She wondered if having her here, a living reminder of everything that had gone wrong between them, would be torture for him. It would certainly be torture for her. She had not allowed herself to think of him in years, had ruthlessly suppressed every memory, every moment of weakness when she found herself wondering what might have been. It had been necessary for her survival, for her sanity. Loving Dorian had been the defining experience of her youth, the measure against which every subsequent feeling had been weighed and found wanting. And when she had realized that she could not have him, that their different stations and his lack of fortune made marriage impossible, she had done what she had to do. She had chosen security over passion, duty over desire. She had married Alistair, and she had tried to be happy, tried to convince herself that affection and respect were enough, that the steady warmth of companionate marriage could replace the consuming fire she had felt for Dorian. For a while, she had almost succeeded. Alistair had been kind, attentive in his way. He had given her a position in society, a beautiful home, everything a woman was supposed to want. If he had also been reckless with money, weak-willed when it came to gambling, prone to making promises he could not keep, well, those were failings she could have forgiven if they had not destroyed her security so completely. But standing here now in Dorian's house, breathing air that carried his scent, knowing he was somewhere in this building thinking God knew what thoughts, she felt all her careful defenses crumbling. She felt like that girl again, the one who had believed love could conquer every obstacle, who had thought that passion was worth any sacrifice. She had been wrong then, and she could not afford to be wrong again. Dinner that evening was a study in controlled tension. The dining room was another vast space, capable of seating 30 with ease, but Dorian had arranged for them to use the small table near the fireplace, creating an island of intimacy in an ocean of empty chairs. Candles flickered in silver candelabras, casting shifting shadows across his face as he carved the roast with surgical precision. They spoke of safe things, the weather, the condition of the roads, the beauty of the countryside. Each topic was explored with the thoroughness of two people determined not to discuss anything that mattered, anything that might lead them into dangerous territory. Marianne found herself watching his hands as he talked, remembering the way they had looked holding a pencil when he used to sketch her portrait in the gardens of her father's estate, the way they had trembled slightly the first time he had dared to brush a stray curl from her face. "You are not eating," he observed. and she realized she had been pushing food around her plate without actually consuming any of it. "I am sorry," she said, setting down her fork. "It is very good. I am simply not as hungry as I thought." He studied her for a moment, his grey eyes unreadable in the candlelight. "You have lost weight. Too much weight. Were things truly so dire in London?" "Food seemed less important than keeping a roof over my head," she admitted. "I dismissed most of the staff, tried to economize where I could, but it was never enough. The debts kept mounting." His jaw tightened. "How long were you living like that? Struggling alone?" "Since Alistair died. A little over a year." "A year." He set down his knife with more force than necessary, the silver clanging against china. "You suffered for a year before you came to me." "Why?" "Because coming to you was the hardest thing I could imagine," she thought. "Because I was terrified of what I might feel if I saw you again." "Pride," she said aloud, which was also true. "And shame." It felt like admitting failure, like proving that everyone who warned me not to marry Alistair had been right. "I never warned you not to marry him," Dorian said quietly. "I was not given that privilege." She looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with an expression that was equal parts frustration and something that looked like old hurt. "It means that by the time I heard you were engaged to Winthorne, the bans had already been read twice. It means I had no opportunity to object, to offer an alternative, to even speak to you about your decision. I had been in Scotland for 6 months, settling Edmund's affairs after he died, learning how to be a duke when I had no training and no desire for the role. And when I finally returned to London, you were 2 weeks from becoming another man's wife." "You could have written," she said, hearing the accusation in her own voice, unable to suppress it. "To say what?" His voice was rough now, the careful control slipping. "To beg you to wait for me when I had nothing to offer? When I was grieving and lost and trying to keep an estate afloat that my brother had run into the ground with his bad investments and worse management? What was I supposed to say, Marianne? Please do not marry the wealthy, established lord who can give you everything you deserve. Instead, wait for me, a man who has just inherited a title and a mountain of debt, who barely knows how to manage his own affairs, let alone care for a wife." She stared at him, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. "Edmund ran the estate into debt." "Oh, yes." Dorian's laugh was bitter. "My perfect brother, the ideal heir, was also a gambler and a fool, just like your husband, it seems. He made investments that any reasonable person could have seen were disasters. He mortgaged properties for capital to fund his schemes, and when he died, he left me with a dukedom that was 1 step away from complete ruin." "I did not know," she whispered. "No one told me." "Because I made certain no one knew," he said. "I worked for 5 years to repair the damage, to restore the estate's finances, to pay off the creditors and restore Ashford's reputation. I lived like a monk, never spending a penny on anything that was not absolutely necessary. I refused every social invitation, every opportunity to go to London or participate in the season. I became a hermit because it was the only way to save what was left. And now? Now the estate is solvent, more than solvent. The investments I made have paid off handsomely. Ashford is one of the wealthiest dukedoms in England again." He met her eyes across the table. "But it took everything I had, every ounce of energy, every moment of every day for years. And by the time I had succeeded, you were married. Firmly, irrevocably married. And I told myself it was better that way. That you deserved the life Winthorne could give you immediately, not the uncertain future I would have offered. That I had made the right choice by not pursuing you, by letting you go." "Did you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Make the right choice?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw all the years of loneliness, all the nights spent wondering, all the regrets he had never voiced. "I do not know," he said finally. "I thought I did. But sitting here with you now, knowing what your marriage cost you, what your husband's recklessness put you through." He shook his head. "Perhaps there are no right choices, only choices we make and then live with." The silence that fell between them was heavy with everything they were not saying, all the what-ifs and might-have-beens that hung in the air like ghosts. Marianne felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. She had not cried when Alistair died, had not cried when the creditors came, had not allowed herself the luxury of tears through any of it. She would not start now. "I should retire," she said, rising from her chair. "It has been a long day." Dorian stood as well, the perfect gentleman, though his eyes were still dark with emotion. "Of course. Sleep well, Marianne." She made it halfway to the door before he spoke again. "I am glad you came." His voice was soft but clear. "Whatever the reason, however desperate the circumstances, I am glad to have you here." She did not turn around, did not trust herself to look at him. "Good night, Dorian." The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that made staying in bed appealing and venturing outdoors seem foolish. Marianne woke late, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar room, then remembering where she was and why. She dressed with the help of a shy young maid, who seemed in awe of having a guest to attend, then made her way downstairs in search of breakfast. Mrs. Holloway intercepted her in the hall, directing her to a bright morning room where a substantial breakfast had been laid out. Dorian was already there, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. He turned when she entered, and she saw that he looked as though he had slept as poorly as she had. "Good morning," he said. "I hope the rain has not dampened your spirits too greatly." "Not at all," she assured him, moving to the sideboard to select items from the impressive array of food. "I find rain rather soothing, actually. Alistair always said I was peculiar that way." She regretted mentioning her husband the moment the words left her mouth. Dorian's expression closed slightly, the easy greeting replaced by something more guarded. "Did you love him?" he asked abruptly. "Your husband." "Did you love him?" She turned to face him, a plate in her hands, the question hanging between them like a challenge. She could lie. She could tell him what he probably wanted to hear, what would make this situation simpler. But something in his eyes, in the way he was looking at her with such naked need to know, made deception impossible. "I cared for him," she said carefully. "I respected him. He was kind to me in his fashion. But love?" She shook her head slowly. "No, not the way you mean. Not the way—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Not the way you loved me," Dorian said quietly. "Not a question." "No," she whispered. "Not like that." He set down his coffee cup with exaggerated care, as though it were made of the most fragile porcelain, as though any sudden movement might shatter something more important than china. "I wrote to you," he said. "Did you know that? After Edmund died, when I was in Scotland, I wrote you dozens of letters, told you everything. About the estate, about my grief, about how much I missed you, about how I planned to put everything right so I could come back to you with something to offer besides empty hands and a broken heart." She felt the blood drain from her face. "I never received any letters." "I know, because I never sent them." He moved toward her, stopping just out of reach. "I would write them late at night, pour everything into the pages, and then in the morning I would read them over and realize how selfish I was being. You deserved certainty, security. You deserved a man who could take care of you immediately, not someone who was asking you to wait years while he figured out how to be something he never wanted to be. So I burned them, every single one." "You had no right," she said, anger sparking through the shock. "No right to make that decision for me. You should have sent them. You should have let me choose." "Would it have changed anything?" he demanded. "If I had told you I loved you but could offer you nothing but a crumbling estate and uncertain prospects? If I had asked you to wait for me while I disappeared into Scotland for months, maybe years, would you have said yes? Would you have turned down Winthorne's proposal and trusted that I would eventually become someone worthy of you?" "I do not know," she said honestly, "but I should have had the chance to decide. Instead, you decided for me. You took away my choice just as surely as my father did when he encouraged the match with Alistair, just as everyone did when they told me that marrying for position and security was the only sensible course. You are right." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "You are absolutely right. I was a coward. I told myself I was being noble, being selfless. But the truth is I was terrified. Terrified that if I asked you to wait, you would say no. Terrified that if I offered you my love without anything material to back it up, you would choose someone else anyway. So I made the decision for both of us, and I have regretted it every day since. The rain hammered against the windows, filling the silence that fell between them. Marianne set down her plate, her appetite gone completely now. "What do you want from me, Dorian?" she asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you are here," he said simply. "Because for the first time in more than 10 years, I have the chance to say all the things I should have said then. Because I cannot let you leave without you knowing the truth of why I stayed silent, even if that truth makes you hate me." "I could never hate you," she said softly. "That is the problem. I could never manage to hate you no matter how much easier that would have made everything." He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of beard along his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each controlled breath. "Tell me what you felt," he said quietly. "Back then, when you agreed to marry Winthorne. Tell me what you were thinking." She closed her eyes, not wanting to see his face, as she spoke the words she had never allowed herself to say aloud. "I was thinking that I was being practical, that I was doing what everyone expected of me, that Alistair was a good man who could give me a comfortable life, and that was what mattered." She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze squarely. "I was thinking that if I could not have you, then it did not matter who I married. That one comfortable prison was as good as another." "Prison," he repeated as though testing the word. "What else would you call a marriage without love, without passion? I performed my duties as a wife. I managed his household, hosted his dinners, appeared on his arm at every social function. I smiled and made conversation and pretended to be content. But inside I was dying a little every day, remembering what it had felt like to be with you, to laugh with you, to believe that there might be something more to life than simply enduring it with grace." "God, Marianne." His voice was rough, and she saw him clench his fists at his sides, as though physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "If I had known—" "What would you have done?" she challenged. "Would you have stormed my wedding? Carried me off like some hero in a novel? We both made our choices, Dorian. We both decided that duty mattered more than desire, and now we have to live with those decisions. Do we?" He took another step closer, and now there was barely any space between them at all. "You are a widow now, free from obligation to a husband who betrayed your trust and ruined you financially. I am a duke with more money than I know what to do with, and an empty house that echoes with loneliness. Why do we have to keep living with old choices? Why can we not make new ones?" Her heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," he said slowly, deliberately, "that perhaps the universe has given us a second chance, that perhaps your coming here was not just about money and debts, but about something else entirely. Something we both need and have denied ourselves for far too long." "That is dangerous talk," she whispered, even as every fiber of her being yearned toward him. "Is it? Or is it simply honest?" He raised one hand, hovering just beside her cheek, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his palm. "I have spent a decade being cautious and responsible, and doing everything that was expected of me. And all it has brought me is this vast empty house and memories that will not let me sleep. If there is even a chance that we could have something real, something true, do we not owe it to ourselves to at least consider it? And if it ends badly—" She could barely force the words out. "If we try and fail, I have already lost everything once, Dorian. I do not think I could survive losing you again." "Then we do not fail," he said with a fierce certainty that made her want to believe him. "We do not make the same mistakes. We do not let pride or fear or duty separate us. We choose each other, and we hold on no matter what comes." His hand settled against her cheek, and the contact sent electricity racing through her entire body. She leaned into his touch without meaning to, her eyes fluttering closed at the simple pleasure of his skin against hers. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with tenderness, with genuine feeling. Alistair had been dutiful even in the bedroom, mechanical in his affections. She had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by someone who truly wanted her. "Look at me," Dorian murmured, and she opened her eyes to find him gazing down at her with such intensity that it stole her breath. "I am going to kiss you now, and if you do not want that, if you think it is a mistake, you need to tell me right now, because once I start, I am not certain I will be able to stop." She should push him away. She should remember all the reasons why this was complicated and dangerous and possibly disastrous. She should protect her heart, guard what little remained of her damaged pride. But she had spent more than 10 years being careful and sensible and doing what was expected, and it had brought her nothing but loneliness and regret. "Do not stop," she whispered. His mouth came down on hers with a hunger that bordered on desperation, and she met him with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his jacket as she rose on her toes to press closer. The kiss was nothing like the chaste exchanges of their youth, the stolen moments in gardens when they were young and uncertain. This was the kiss of two people who had waited too long, who had suffered too much, who needed each other with a ferocity that transcended reason. His arms came around her, crushing her against him, and she felt the hard length of his body against hers, felt the way he trembled with the effort of maintaining some measure of control. She did not want his control. She wanted his passion, his abandon, his complete surrender to this thing between them that had never truly died despite years of distance and denial. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face, as though she were something infinitely precious. "I have dreamed of doing that for so long," he admitted, his voice ragged. "Every night, Marianne, every single night, you have haunted me." "And you me," she confessed. "Even when I was trying hardest to forget you, you were there. In every moment of disappointment, every instance of loneliness, I thought of you and wondered if things could have been different. They can be different now." He kissed her again, more gently this time, but no less thoroughly. "Stay with me. Not as a guest seeking temporary refuge, but as something more. Let me court you properly, the way I should have done all those years ago. Let me show you that I am worthy of you now, that I can give you everything you deserve." "I do not need courting," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I am not a young girl who requires pretty words and careful proprieties. I know what I want, Dorian. I have always known. The question is whether you are brave enough to take what we both need without worrying about society's expectations or what anyone else might think." His eyes darkened with desire and something that looked like shock. "Are you saying—" "I am saying that I am a widow, not a virgin bride. I am saying that I have wasted enough of my life being cautious and proper. I am saying that if you want me, truly want me, then I am yours. Here and now. No more waiting." For a moment he simply stared at her, as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from severe to devastating. "Are you certain?" he asked, even as his hands moved to her waist, pulling her against him once more. "Because if we do this, Marianne, there will be no going back. I will not let you go again, not for any reason. You will be mine in every way that matters, and I will be yours, completely, irrevocably." "I am counting on it," she said, and then she kissed him again, pouring into that kiss every ounce of longing, every year of loneliness, every moment of regret she had carried with her like a stone. He lifted her without breaking the kiss, carrying her from the morning room with a decisive stride that spoke of a man who had made up his mind and would not be deterred. She did not ask where they were going, did not care. All that mattered was the feel of his arms around her, the heat of his mouth on hers, the knowledge that finally, after so many years of denial, she was going to have what she had always wanted. His chambers were in the East Wing, a suite of rooms that managed to be both masculine and elegant, with dark wood furniture and deep jewel-toned fabrics. The bed was enormous, dominating the room, and he set her down beside it with a gentleness that belied the urgency she could feel thrumming through his body. "Last chance to change your mind," he said, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking along her cheekbones. "Tell me to stop and I will. I will walk away and we will pretend this never happened." "I do not want to pretend anymore," she said firmly. "I want this. I want you. I have always wanted you." That was all the permission he needed. His mouth found hers again, as his hands moved to the buttons of her dress, working them with a dexterity that suggested he was not as composed as he pretended to be. She helped him when his fingers fumbled, laughing softly against his lips at his muttered curse when a particularly stubborn button refused to cooperate. "How many damned layers do women wear?" he grumbled, and she laughed again, the sound free and genuine in a way she had not laughed in years. "Far too many," she agreed, and then she was helping him, pulling at fabric and laces until finally she stood before him, in nothing but her chemise, her dress and petticoats pooled at her feet. He stepped back, his gaze moving over her with an appreciation that made her feel beautiful despite everything, despite the weight she had lost and the worry she had carried. In his eyes, she saw desire, but also tenderness, passion tempered with genuine care. "You are exquisite," he said quietly, "more beautiful than I remembered, and I have remembered every single detail for 10 years. She reached for the buttons of his shirt, needing to touch him, to confirm that this was real, that she was not simply dreaming. "Then let me see if my memory matches reality." He helped her remove his clothes with more efficiency than she had managed with hers, and then he was standing before her, gloriously bare, his body a testament to the physical labor he had clearly not disdained during his years of rebuilding the estate. He was lean but muscular, every line and plane sculpted and strong, and when she reached out to touch his chest, feeling his heart thundering beneath her palm, she thought she had never seen anything more perfect. He lifted her onto the bed, following her down, covering her body with his in a way that felt both protective and possessive. When he kissed her this time, it was with a thoroughness that left no doubt about his intentions, his mouth moving from her lips to her jaw to the sensitive spot just below her ear that made her gasp. "Tell me if I do anything you do not like," he murmured against her skin. "Tell me what you want, what you need." "You," she said simply. "Just you." And then there were no more words, only sensation and heat and the overwhelming rightness of finally being with the one person who had always held her heart. He was patient despite his obvious need, taking his time to learn her responses, to discover what made her sigh and what made her moan. When he finally joined their bodies, moving into her with exquisite care, she felt tears spill from the corners of her eyes at the sheer perfection of it. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately, stilling concern overriding passion. "Am I hurting you?" "No," she managed, pulling him closer, urging him to continue. "No, it is just... It has never been like this, never felt like this." Understanding dawned in his eyes, and he kissed her with such tenderness that more tears came, even as pleasure built low in her belly, coiling tighter and tighter with each controlled thrust. "Let go," he whispered against her lips. "I have you. Let go, my love." And she did, surrendering to sensation with a completeness she had never allowed herself before, trusting him to catch her as she shattered in his arms. He followed moments later, his own control finally breaking as he called her name like a prayer, his body shuddering with the force of his release. They lay tangled together in the aftermath, hearts gradually slowing, breathing returning to normal. He shifted to lie beside her rather than crushing her, but kept her close, one arm wrapped firmly around her waist, as though afraid she might try to escape. "I love you," he said quietly, the words simple but weighted with years of denial. "I have loved you since I was 20 years old and you laughed at one of my terrible jokes. I loved you when you married another man. I loved you through every lonely year in this house, and I will love you until the day I die. That is not going to change, Marianne. Whatever happens, however complicated this becomes, that fundamental truth remains." She turned in his arms so she could see his face, see the vulnerability there, the fear that she might not return the sentiment. "I love you too," she said, watching relief and joy transform his expression. "I never stopped loving you. Not even when I thought I should, when I tried to convince myself that what I felt for you was just a young girl's infatuation that would fade with time. It did not fade. It only grew stronger and more painful with every year that passed." He kissed her then slowly and deeply, a kiss that held promise rather than urgency, commitment rather than mere passion. When he finally drew back, he was smiling in a way she had never seen him smile, with genuine happiness rather than polite courtesy or social necessity. "Marry me," he said. Not because you need my money or my protection, not because society expects it, but because we love each other and have wasted enough time already. Marry me and help me turn this mausoleum into a home. Give me children to fill the empty nursery. Grow old with me, and let us make up for all the years we lost. People will talk, she warned, even as her heart sang at the prospect. They will say I trapped you, that I used my financial troubles to manipulate you into an engagement. They will speculate about how quickly I moved from mourning to marriage. Let them talk, he said firmly. I do not care what anyone thinks anymore. I spent 10 years caring about duty and reputation and doing what was expected. Now I am going to do what I want, and I want you. If society chooses to disapprove, that is society's problem, not ours. She thought about the creditors who would be paid off, the security she would have, the life she could build here with him. But more than that, she thought about waking up beside him every morning, about facing each day knowing she was loved and valued for herself rather than her position or her connections. She thought about the possibility of children, of filling this echoing house with laughter and life, of finally having the family she had always dreamed of. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. As soon as can be arranged. I do not want to wait any longer than necessary. His answering smile was brilliant, and he kissed her again, the kiss quickly deepening as desire reignited between them. They made love again, more slowly this time, learning each other's bodies with the leisure of people who knew they had all the time in the world. And when they finally emerged from his chambers much later, disheveled and thoroughly satisfied, Marianne felt as though she had been reborn, as though she had finally stepped out of the shadow that had hung over her life since she had made the wrong choice all those years ago. The following weeks passed in a haze of happiness that felt almost surreal after so many years of loneliness and struggle. Dorian threw himself into resolving her financial troubles with the same intensity he had once devoted to saving his estate, his solicitors working tirelessly to track down every creditor and satisfy every claim. Within a month her debts were settled, the threat of imprisonment lifted, and she found herself in the unprecedented position of being not just financially secure, but actually wealthy in her own right, since Dorian insisted on settling a generous sum on her independent of their marriage. I will not have you feeling dependent or trapped, he explained, when she protested that it was too much. You need to know that you are choosing to stay with me because you want to, not because you have no other option. This money is yours to do with as you wish. If you decide tomorrow that you cannot bear to be married to me after all, you can walk away, knowing you will be comfortable. I am not going to walk away, she assured him, touched by his thoughtfulness, but I appreciate the gesture nonetheless, and the autonomy it represents. They were married quietly in the chapel at Ashford Manor, with only Mrs. Holloway and a handful of servants as witnesses. Marianne wore a simple dress of ivory silk rather than elaborate bridal finery, and Dorian looked devastatingly handsome in dark grey. The vicar kept the ceremony brief, perhaps sensing that neither of them had any patience for long speeches or elaborate rituals. They wanted only to be legally bound, officially united, able to face the world as a couple, without any remaining shadow of impropriety. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Dorian kissed her with enough enthusiasm to make Mrs. Holloway blush and the other servants grin. And Marianne thought that she had never been happier, that this moment, right here, was worth all the suffering that had come before. They did not travel for a wedding trip, both preferring to remain at Ashford and simply enjoy being together without the complications of travel or the scrutiny of society. They spent their days walking the grounds, planning improvements to the house and gardens, discussing how they might open up rooms that had been closed for years and breathe life back into spaces that had become shrouded in dust and melancholy. At night, they retired early to their shared chambers, making love with increasing familiarity and decreasing desperation, learning to savor each touch, each kiss, each whispered word of love. Marianne found herself blooming under his attention, her body filling out again as regular meals and genuine happiness replaced the stress and deprivation of her widowhood. She laughed more easily, smiled more often, and discovered reserves of joy she had thought permanently depleted. But it was not all perfect bliss. There were still shadows that needed to be addressed, wounds that required healing beyond just the physical act of being together. One evening, as they sat before the fire in the library, Marianne curled against Dorian's side with a book she was not actually reading. He spoke quietly into the comfortable silence. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of tension that immediately put her on alert. She set aside her book, turning to face him fully. "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames, his jaw working as though he were trying to find the right words. "When Edmund died," he finally said, "I was angry at him. Furious, actually, because he left me with this impossible burden, this role I never wanted and was not prepared for. And because—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Because the day he died, we had argued. Badly. I told him he was destroying everything our father had built, that his recklessness was going to ruin the family. And he told me I was a sanctimonious prig who would never understand what it meant to carry the weight of everyone's expectations." "Oh, Dorian," she said softly, beginning to understand. "He rode out in anger," Dorian continued, his voice thick with old grief. "Took fences too fast, pushed his horse beyond wisdom, and when he fell, when he struck his head, I was not there. I was still in the house, still angry, still thinking about all the cutting things I wanted to say to him when he returned. Except he never returned, and the last words between us were spoken in rage." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, squeezing tight. "It was not your fault. Was it not?" He looked at her then, and she saw the guilt that had been eating at him for years, the responsibility he had taken on for a death that was ultimately an accident. If I had not argued with him, if I had kept my mouth shut about his failures, perhaps he would not have ridden so recklessly. Perhaps he would still be alive. And perhaps he would have continued his reckless behavior and dragged the estate down completely, she countered gently. Perhaps he would have died in some other foolish venture. You cannot know, Dorian. You cannot take responsibility for choices another person made, even if those choices were influenced by anger. Edmund was an adult. He decided to ride recklessly. That was his decision, not yours. I tell myself that, he admitted, but it doesn't erase the guilt. And when you came here, when I saw you standing in that gallery looking at his portrait, all of it came rushing back. The waste of it, the futility, the way people I loved kept slipping away from me through death or duty or my own damned pride. She moved then, shifting so she could straddle his lap, forcing him to look at her, to really see her. I am not slipping away, she said firmly. I am right here. I am your wife. I love you. And I am not going anywhere unless you physically push me away, which I do not believe you are capable of doing. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You are rather persistent. I have to be, she said. You have a tendency toward brooding and self-recrimination that requires constant intervention. Someone needs to remind you that you are allowed to be happy, that you deserve love and joy and all the good things you have spent years denying yourself. And you have appointed yourself to that role? But he was smiling now, genuine warmth in his eyes. I have, she confirmed. It is a difficult job, but someone must do it. And since I love you more than anyone else in the world, I suppose that someone is me. He pulled her closer, burying his face against her neck, his arms tight around her waist. What did I do to deserve you? You became a good man despite having every excuse not to be, she said simply. You took responsibility when it was thrust upon you. You saved an estate when you could have let it crumble. You helped me when I had nowhere else to turn, even though seeing me again must have been painful. You are kind and honorable and decent, Dorian Ashford, whether you believe it or not. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you remember it. They made love there in front of the fire, slow and tender, a reaffirmation of the commitment they had made to each other and the life they were building together. And afterward, as they lay tangled in each other's arms on the carpet, covered by the blanket Dorian had pulled from the sofa, Marianne thought that this was what she had been missing all those years with Alistair. Not just passion, though that was certainly part of it, but true intimacy, the ability to be vulnerable, to share fears and failures, to be seen completely and loved anyway. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Ashford Manor began to transform. Rooms that had been shrouded in dust covers were opened and aired. Servants were hired to fill positions that had stood vacant for years. The gardens, which had been maintained but not loved, received new attention as Marianne worked with the head gardener to plan beds of roses and lavender, of tulips and daffodils. She ordered new curtains for the drawing room, commissioned repairs to the fountain in the south garden, suggested that they host a dinner party for the neighbouring families who had largely given up trying to draw Dorian back into society. "Are you certain you want to do this?" he asked when she proposed the dinner party. "We could continue as we are, just the two of us. I am perfectly content with that arrangement." "But I am not," she said gently. "Dorian, you have isolated yourself here for too long. This house needs life, laughter, the sound of voices other than ours. And you need to remember that being a duke means more than just managing an estate. It means being part of a community, contributing to the social fabric, showing the next generation what good leadership looks like." He grimaced. "I have never been good at social events." "That is because you have always felt you had to perform, to be someone you were not," she countered. "But now you are in your own home, hosting on your own terms. You can be yourself, and if people do not like it, well, they are not obligated to accept future invitations." The dinner party was a success, though not without its awkward moments. Some of the guests were clearly curious about Marianne, about how quickly she had gone from widowhood to a new marriage, about whether there was some scandal lurking beneath the surface. But Dorian handled it all with a grace she had not expected, making it clear through both word and gesture that he adored his new wife and would tolerate no whispers or speculation about her character. And gradually, as word spread about the changes at Ashford Manor, about the Duke who had finally emerged from his self-imposed exile, and the Duchess who had brought warmth back to the cold halls, the invitations began arriving. Requests for them to attend parties, balls, country gatherings. Most of these Dorian politely declined, but he agreed to a few, wanting to please Marianne, wanting to show her that he was not going to keep her prisoner in isolation the way his grief had imprisoned him. It was at one such event, a ball held by the local viscount, that they encountered the first real test of their marriage. Marianne had been speaking with a group of ladies about plans for a charity bazaar when she looked up to see Dorian in heated conversation with a man she did not recognize. The stranger was well dressed, but there was something unpleasant about his expression, something sneering and superior that immediately put her on edge. She excused herself from the ladies and made her way across the ballroom, arriving in time to hear the stranger say, "Really, Ashford, one must admire your timing, if nothing else. To swoop in and rescue a damsel in distress, particularly one you had already formed an attachment to in your youth, and then marry her within weeks of settling her debts. It is almost romantic if one is inclined to view it charitably." "And if one is not inclined to view it charitably," Dorian's voice was dangerously soft, "then one might think that the lady cleverly manipulated you into exactly the position she desired. A wealthy duke, besotted with an old flame, too blind to see that he is being used for his fortune. But I am sure that is not the case." The man's smile was vicious. After all, what woman would be so calculating? Marianne reached them before Dorian could respond, inserting herself between her husband and the stranger with a pleasant smile that did not reach her eyes. "I do not believe we have been introduced," she said coolly. "I am the Duchess of Ashford." The man bowed slightly, his expression suggesting he was not at all intimidated by her title. "Lord Pembroke, I was just discussing with your husband the remarkable circumstances of your recent marriage." "Were you?" She kept her voice light, cordial, though she felt anger building in her chest. "How kind of you to take such interest in our private affairs, though I confess I am curious what gives you the right to speculate about matters that do not concern you." "Marianne," Dorian began, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "No," she said firmly. "Lord Pembroke has raised questions about my character and my motivations. I believe I have earned the right to respond." She turned her full attention back to Pembroke, allowing some of the steel she had developed during her difficult widowhood to show through. "You suggest that I manipulated my husband into marriage by playing upon his affections and his generosity. Let me be very clear about the reality of the situation. I came to Dorian when I was desperate, when I had exhausted every other option. I asked for a loan, not a proposal. The marriage was his idea, his choice, and I initially refused because I did not want anyone, including him, to question my motives. How convenient, Pembroke began, but she spoke over him. He pursued me, Lord Pembroke. He convinced me that our feelings for each other, feelings that had existed long before my financial troubles, were worth more than society's good opinion. And he was right. I married him because I love him, because I have loved him since I was 18 years old, because even when I was married to another man, I could not stop thinking about him. If that makes me calculating in your eyes, then I suppose I must simply bear that judgment. But I will not stand here and allow you to impugn either my honor or his intelligence. Silence had fallen around them, other guests pausing their conversations to listen to this fascinating confrontation. Pembroke's face had gone red, his eyes narrowing with anger at being publicly dressed down by a woman. "You overstep, madam." "No, sir, you overstep," Dorian said, his voice cutting through Pembroke's protest like a blade. "You come to a social event and use it as an opportunity to insult my wife, to question her integrity, and suggest that I am some sort of fool easily led by a pretty face. Let me be extraordinarily clear. I pursued Marianne. I convinced her to marry me, and I would do it again in an instant, because she is the best thing that has ever happened to me. If you have a problem with that, if you feel the need to spread rumors or cast aspersions, then you may direct them at me. Leave my wife out of your petty jealousies and small-minded judgments." "Jealousies?" Pembroke sputtered. "I assure you, you were one of the creditors, were you not?" Marianne said suddenly, memory clicking into place. "One of the men holding debts from my late husband. I remember seeing your name on the documents, and you were quite upset when you learned that the debts were being paid off, because you had been hoping to—" She paused, understanding dawning. "Oh, you had been hoping to pressure me into some sort of arrangement, had you not? Something that would have benefited you beyond simply recovering the money you were owed." Pembroke's face went from red to nearly purple. "How dare you suggest—" "Am I wrong?" she challenged. "Is that not why you are so angry about my marriage? Because it removed any leverage you thought you might have over a desperate widow?" The crowd around them had grown larger, people watching with undisguised fascination. Pembroke seemed to realize that he had lost this confrontation badly, that any further protest would only make him look worse. He sketched a stiff bow in their direction. "I bid you good evening," he said coldly, and then he was striding away toward the door, his exit accompanied by a wave of whispers and speculative looks. Dorian turned to Marianne, concern replacing anger in his expression. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she assured him, though her hands were shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "But perhaps we should take our leave as well. I think we have provided enough entertainment for one evening." They made their farewells to their hosts and departed, riding back to Ashford in their carriage in silence. But when they arrived home and retreated to their chambers, Dorian pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke of how affected he had been by the confrontation. "I am sorry," he said against her hair. "Sorry that you had to face that people are saying such things." "People will always say things," she replied practically. "We cannot control that. We can only control how we respond. And I think we responded rather well, all things considered." He drew back to look at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You were magnificent, absolutely magnificent. I have never seen someone eviscerate another person so thoroughly while maintaining perfect politeness. One of the few useful skills I developed during my marriage to Alistair," she said dryly. "The ability to smile while destroying someone's argument. Very useful in social settings." He laughed, the tension finally draining from his shoulders. "Remind me never to cross you." "Oh, I do not think you are in any danger," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "You are far too clever to make the kinds of mistakes that would put you in my bad graces." "I'm going to hold you to that," he murmured against her lips, "because I intend to keep you happy for the next 50 years at minimum, and I would prefer not to be eviscerated in the process." 50 years, she pretended to consider. "I suppose I could manage that, though you will have to work very hard to keep me entertained for that long." "I accept the challenge," he said, and then he was kissing her properly, thoroughly, with the kind of passion that still made her knees weak even after months of marriage. The seasons turned, bringing summer and then autumn, and with the autumn came the news that Marianne had been hoping for and Dorian had been dreaming of. She was with child, due to deliver in the spring. The announcement was made with appropriate gravity to the household staff, who received it with genuine joy and relief. Ashford Manor would have an heir, a new generation to carry on the family name and legacy. Dorian was alternately thrilled and terrified, fussing over her to a degree that would have been annoying if it were not so endearing. He insisted she rest more, worry less, avoid any activity that might be remotely strenuous. She tolerated his overprotectiveness with amused patience, knowing it came from love rather than any desire to control her. As her belly grew and the reality of impending parenthood became impossible to ignore, they spent long evenings discussing the future. What kind of parents they wanted to be, how they would handle the pressures of raising a child in their position, whether they wanted to follow society's conventions of distant parenting or be more involved in their child's daily life. "I do not want our child raised by servants," Marianne said one evening as they lay together in bed, Dorian's hand resting on her rounded stomach, feeling the baby kick. "I know it is not fashionable. I know people will talk, but I want to be a real mother, not just a figurehead who appears for formal occasions." "I agree," Dorian said immediately. "I barely knew my own parents. They were distant figures who appeared occasionally to inspect us and comment on our progress. When Edmund died, I realized I had missed the opportunity to truly know him as a person, not just as the heir. I do not want that for our children." "Children?" She smiled. "Are we assuming there will be more than one?" "I certainly hope so," he said, grinning, "though perhaps we should successfully navigate the first one before we start planning a large family." The baby chose that moment to kick particularly vigorously, making them both laugh. Dorian pressed a kiss to her stomach, then moved up to capture her lips with his. "Thank you," he said softly, "for this, for everything, for being brave enough to come here when you needed help, for giving me a second chance, for making this house a home." "You do not need to thank me," she replied, touching his face gently. "I should be thanking you. You saved me, Dorian. In every way a person can be saved. You gave me security, yes, but more importantly, you gave me love. Purpose, a future I can actually look forward to. I was dying inside during those years with Alistair, slowly suffocating under the weight of duty and disappointment. And then you brought me back to life." Their daughter was born on a rainy spring morning, arriving with remarkable speed and a set of lungs that suggested she would not be a quiet child. Marianne held her and wept, overwhelmed by the rush of love for this tiny, perfect creature they had created. And when Dorian finally came into the room, when he looked down at his daughter with wonder and fear and fierce protectiveness written across his face, she knew that everything they had been through, all the pain and separation and difficulty, had been worth it to arrive at this moment. They named her Eleanor after Marianne's mother, and Dorian declared her the most beautiful baby ever born, despite the fact that she looked like every other newborn, red-faced and squalling. But in his eyes she was perfect, and he spent hours just holding her, marveling at her tiny fingers and toes, the way she would grip his finger with surprising strength. The christening was held on a beautiful summer day, with half the county in attendance. Eleanor wore an elaborate gown of white silk and lace, handed down through the Ashford family for generations. She slept through most of the ceremony, waking only to protest loudly when the vicar sprinkled water on her forehead. At the celebration afterward, with guests milling about the grounds of Ashford Manor and children running through the gardens that Marianne had restored to blooming glory, Dorian pulled her aside to a quiet corner of the terrace. "I want to show you something," he said, taking her hand and leading her back into the house away from the party. He brought her to the gallery, that same gallery where they had first encountered each other again after so many years apart. But something was different now. There was a new portrait on the wall hanging directly across from Edmund's. It showed a woman with dark hair and warm eyes, a gentle smile playing about her lips. She wore a simple dress in a muted blue that somehow seemed to make her glow from within, and in her arms she held a sleeping infant, the baby's face peaceful and content. Marianne stared at the portrait, at this depiction of herself and Eleanor, and felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "When did you commission this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Months ago," he admitted. "The artist came while you were resting, painted from memory and some sketches I had made. I wanted... He paused, seeming to search for words. This gallery has always been a place of memory for me, of loss and grief and regret. I wanted to change that. I wanted there to be something here that represented hope and joy and the future. You and Eleanor, you are that for me. You are my second chance, my redemption, the proof that even when we make terrible choices and waste years in regret, it is still possible to find happiness. She turned to him, cupping his face in her hands, looking at this man who had loved her for so long, who had waited and suffered and finally found the courage to claim what he wanted. I love you, she said simply. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I am so very, very glad that I was brave enough to come here that day, even though I was terrified, because this, right here, this life we have built together, this is what I was always meant to have. He kissed her then, there in the gallery beneath the painted eyes of generations of Ashfords, and she felt the rightness of it settling into her bones. They had taken the long road to get here, had made mistakes and suffered losses, and learned hard lessons about pride and duty and the cost of denying one's heart. But they had arrived at last at this place of peace and love and genuine happiness, and as they returned to their guests, to the celebration of their daughter and their life together, Marianne thought about how strange and wonderful it was that a forbidden kiss in her youth had led to this. That the love she had tried so hard to bury, to deny, to forget, had refused to die. That sometimes the heart knew what it wanted, long before the mind was willing to admit it. She had been the widow who came begging for help, desperate and alone. He had been the duke who had never forgotten her, who had carried his love for her like a torch through dark years. And together they had found a way back to each other, had built something real and lasting from the ashes of old dreams and new hopes. Their story was not the one she had planned when she was young and idealistic, thinking love alone could conquer all obstacles, but it was better than that story could ever have been, richer and deeper, tempered by experience and loss, and the knowledge that happiness was not a given, but something to be fought for and treasured. As the sun set over Ashford Manor, casting golden light across the gardens and the gathered guests, Marianne stood beside her husband, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for second chances, for love that endured, for the courage to ask for help when she needed it, and for the man who had opened his door, his home and his heart when she had nowhere else to turn. The forbidden kiss of their youth had become the foundation of a marriage, built on genuine love and mutual respect. And that, she thought, was worth all the waiting, all the pain, all the years spent apart. Because in the end, they had found their way back to each other, and that was the only ending that mattered. Epilogue. 5 years had passed since Eleanor's christening, and Ashford Manor had transformed in ways that went far beyond new curtains and restored gardens. The sound of children's laughter now echoed through halls that had once known only silence, and the nursery wing that Dorian had thought might remain forever empty housed not just Eleanor, but her younger brother Thomas, and the newest addition, baby Catherine, who had arrived just 3 months prior. Marianne stood at the window of the morning room, watching as Eleanor chased Thomas through the rose garden, their nurse following at a more sedate pace while keeping a careful eye on her charges. At 5 years old, Eleanor had inherited her father's serious grey eyes but her mother's warm smile, a combination that made her devastatingly effective at getting exactly what she wanted from both parents. Thomas, at 3, was all mischief and energy, constantly testing boundaries and finding new ways to create chaos. They are going to be absolutely covered in mud by the time they come inside, Dorian observed from behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Eleanor has already convinced Thomas to investigate something near the fountain, and you know that can only end one way. Let them, Marianne said, leaning back against him contentedly. They are children. They should be allowed to explore and get dirty and have adventures. We can always bathe them afterward. You are far more tolerant of mud than I expected a duchess to be, he teased, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck. That is because I am not just a duchess, she reminded him. I am also a mother who wants her children to actually enjoy their childhood rather than being kept pristine and perfect for appearance's sake. The sound of a carriage on the drive drew their attention, and Marianne felt Dorian tense slightly behind her. They were expecting visitors today, though not the usual sort. After years of estrangement, Dorian's aunt and uncle, his father's brother and sister-in-law, had finally responded to the repeated invitations Marianne had been sending. The breach had occurred shortly after Edmund's death, some disagreement about the estate management that had never been fully explained to her, but she had been determined to heal the family rifts that had left Dorian so isolated. "They came," Dorian said quietly, surprise evident in his voice. "I honestly did not think they would." "People change," Marianne replied, squeezing his hand. "And sometimes they simply need to be reminded that they are wanted. You have changed this house, changed yourself. Perhaps they are ready to see that." The reunion was awkward at first, Lord and Lady Carrington clearly uncertain of their welcome despite the invitation. But Eleanor, with the unself-conscious charm of childhood, broke through the tension by marching directly up to them and announcing that they must come see the new kittens in the stable immediately, as they were the most important thing at Ashford, and everything else could wait. By the time they all returned from admiring the kittens, with Thomas chattering about how he was going to train one to do tricks, and Eleanor solemnly explaining the responsibilities of cat ownership, the atmosphere had thawed considerably. Over tea, Lord Carrington finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I owe you an apology, Dorian," he said heavily. "I said things after Edmund died, made accusations about your capability to manage the estate that were unfair and unkind. I was grieving and I lashed out at the nearest target, but that does not excuse my behavior, and I am sorry for it. You have clearly proven every doubt I expressed to be completely unfounded." Dorian was quiet for a moment, his jaw working with emotion. "I appreciate that, Uncle, truly, and I harbor no ill will. Those were dark days for all of us, and we all said and did things we regretted. What matters is that you are here now, and that we can move forward as families should." Lady Carrington reached across to pat Marianne's hand. "And you, my dear, have clearly been the making of him. This house feels alive again, in a way it has not since I was a girl visiting my husband's family. You have given him what he needed most, love, support, and a reason to rejoin the world rather than hiding from it." The visit extended from the planned afternoon to 3 days, and by the time Lord and Lady Carrington departed, genuine affection had been rekindled. They left with promises to return for Christmas and invitations for Dorian and Marianne to visit their estate in Derbyshire. "You were right," Dorian admitted that evening as they prepared for bed, Catherine sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside them. "About healing the family rifts, about reaching out even when I thought it was pointless. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that I did not need family beyond you and the children. But having them here, seeing Eleanor and Thomas with their great-aunt and uncle, it made me realize what I had been denying them by maintaining my isolation." "We all need family," Marianne said softly, brushing out her hair at the vanity. "And not just the family we create, but the connections to our past, to the people who knew us before we became who we are now. Your children deserve to know their heritage, to have more people in their lives who love them." He came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "How did you become so wise?" "I learned from suffering what not to do," she replied honestly. "I learned that pride is cold comfort when you are alone, that duty without love is merely obligation, that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing." She set down her brush and turned to face him. "And I learned that you, Dorian Ashford, are worth fighting for, worth being brave for, worth risking everything for." He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her close in the way that still made her feel cherished and safe even after years of marriage. "I fall more in love with you every day," he murmured against her hair. "I did not think that was possible. I thought surely there must be a limit to how much one person could love another, but there is not. It simply keeps growing, deepening, becoming more essential." "Good," she said, pulling back to smile up at him. "Because I intend to keep you quite thoroughly enchanted for at least another 50 years, and it would be terribly inconvenient if you became bored with me." "Impossible," he declared. "You are far too interesting, too passionate, Too alive for me to ever be bored. Every day with you is an adventure, even when that adventure consists solely of managing our children's schemes and preventing Thomas from attempting to ride the sheep." "He did not," Marianne said, though she was laughing. "He absolutely did. I caught him yesterday trying to fashion a saddle from a blanket. I have explained that sheep are not horses, but I fear the message has not quite penetrated his stubborn 3-year-old mind." They laughed together, the easy laughter of two people who knew each other completely, who had weathered storms and come out stronger. And later, as they lay in bed with Catherine's soft breathing the only sound in the quiet room, Marianne reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. She had come to Ashford Manor as a desperate widow with nothing but debts and fading hope. She had been prepared to beg, to humble herself, to do whatever was necessary to survive. What she had found instead was a man who had never stopped loving her, who had been waiting all those years for a chance to prove that their love had not been a youthful fantasy, but something real and enduring. She had found a home in this house that had seemed so cold and empty at first. She had found purpose in restoring not just the physical space, but the heart of it, in filling rooms with warmth and laughter, in helping Dorian reconnect with family and community. She had found joy in motherhood, in watching her children grow and thrive, in giving them the childhood of love and freedom that she and Dorian had both been denied in different ways. But most of all, she had found herself. Not the dutiful daughter who had married for security, not the proper wife who had smiled through disappointment, not the desperate widow who had been crushed by circumstances beyond her control. She had become the woman she was always meant to be, strong and loving, passionate and practical, capable of great tenderness and great fierceness in equal measure. The forbidden kiss of her youth had grown into a love that had reshaped both their lives. It had survived separation and loss, doubt and fear, pride and regret. It had waited patiently through years of silence, never quite dying, never quite forgotten. And when given the chance to bloom again, it had become something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. As sleep began to claim her, Marianne's last conscious thought was of gratitude. Gratitude for the courage that had brought her back to Dorian, for the love that had sustained them through difficulty, for the life they had built together brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to cherish. Eleanor would likely convince Thomas to participate in some elaborate game that would result in scraped knees and torn dresses. Catherine would wake demanding to be fed at inconvenient intervals. The estate would require attention, correspondence would need answering, decisions would need making. But they would face it all together, as they always had, as they always would. Two people who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds, who had learned that true love was not about grand gestures or perfect timing, but about choosing each other every single day, in all the small, unremarkable moments that actually comprised a life. And that, Marianne thought as sleep finally took her, was more than enough. It was everything. And, dear listeners, if you have journeyed with us through Marianne and Dorian's story of lost love found again, of second chances and enduring devotion, I would be honored if you would consider subscribing to hear more tales of passion and redemption. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on their journey, and if this story touched your heart, a like would mean the world. Do not forget to activate notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for lending me your time and your attention. Until we meet again in another tale of love and longing, may your own hearts find the courage to pursue what truly matters.